We've been hearing in the recent masses for this time of year, as we grow toward the end of the church year, the church is moving our attention to the end of time, the last things, when Christ will come again to judge the living and the dead. And so, the church has been quoting from the book of Revelation, and we hear visions given to John about the future and about reward for the just and punishment for the evil. But today, what we heard in a revelation, in a vision to the Apostle John, talks about the sweetness and the sourness of our life. We heard about an angel who was given a scroll to eat, and it would be sweet in his mouth and sour in his stomach. And what was that all about? The time in which this was written was a time of persecution for Christians. It was against the law to be a Christian. They were persecuted by the government. Their lives were taken, their property was taken. That was the bitter part, the sufferings of life. The sweet part were the promises of the Lord, the promise that they would have a great reward. This is not exactly a time of persecution for us in our country, although there are Christians today who are being persecuted in the world. In fact, we are told more today are being persecuted than ever before in history. Not in our country, but in many places in the world. But still, we could say that our lives have the sweet and the sour. The sweet are the promises of God. As we said in the song, how sweet to my taste is your promise. It's the promise of God that is the sweet part of our life. That's what we call hope, the expectation of the great happiness and reward that will lie at the end of our life, if we remain faithful. The great sweetness and joy of seeing the promises of God brought to reality, brought before our face when we see Christ and go into our eternal reward. If we keep this in mind, friends, we always have a consolation. However, there is the sour part as well. What is the sour part of our life? That's what the church has always called the cross. We are told we must carry our cross. And what is that? That's the sufferings that come from doing God's will. To do God's will faithfully requires suffering. Or just to accept God's will in other cases involves suffering. To do God's will, to do what God wants me to do, even when it's not easy, that involves suffering. Or to accept God's will, for example, the ordinary pains and loneliness of life. That is God's will for us, usually as we grow older. He wants us to bear that, and that is the cross. The cross is either bearing God's will or doing God's will, and that is hard. But we're told that to follow Jesus, we must carry the cross. There is no way around it. We may seek to get around it, but in the end we must accept God's will and seek to do God's will. That is the sour part. But friends, let us not forget the promises of God, the wonderful things that He has in store for those who keep on the way of following Christ. And when our cross gets difficult, we should look to Christ. Look to Christ when our cross gets difficult. Ask Him to help us. He will help us. And He'll help us all the way till that point when we will experience the wonderful, never-ending joy of heaven. Let us stand now and bring prayers